Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to decode the dense, honestly thriller-like history of the Russian Revolution directly from our source material. We're talking about one of the most seismic shifts in human history, where a 300-year-old absolute monarchy was totally dismantled and replaced by the world's very first socialist state.
Since we're covering decades of complex history, here is our quick roadmap. We'll look at the Tsarist pressure cooker, the early cracks in the empire, the World War I catalyst, the twin revolutions, and finally, the Bolshevik legacy.
So let's start with Section 1, the Tsarist pressure cooker, or how they sealed the pot.
We begin in the late 19th century. Now, to understand the explosion of 1917, you first have to understand the container itself, an empire of absolutely massive scale. Ruling this vast, culturally divided territory was Tsar Nicholas II of the Romanov dynasty. And when our sources call him an absolute autocrat, they mean absolute. The general population literally had zero voice in how the state was run. The Tsar's word? That was unquestionable law across the entire territory.
Obviously, to maintain that kind of total control without giving the public any say, the regime had to rely on some heavy-handed tactics. They basically leaned on three coercive pillars to crush dissent. First, they used a moral authority of the Russian Orthodox Church. Second, the sheer brute force of the army. And third, a highly corrupt administrative bureaucracy which featured a deeply feared special police force known as the gendarmerie, whose whole job was to violently suppress any political opposition.
And adding fuel to that fire was a really hostile state policy called Russification. The Tsar's empire had expanded over centuries, taking in Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Tatars, Finns. This forced assimilation caused incredible friction, which makes total sense when you realize a pretty ironic fact. Non-Russians actually made up more than half of the entire population. Yet the state actively tried to erase their cultures and languages, creating some really intense hostility in the borderland.
Beyond the cultural oppression, things were just an economic mess. You had freed serfs who were financially paralyzed by heavy land redemption loans they owed to their village communes, or mirs. On top of that, you had industrial workers crammed into filthy, unhygienic factories working for absolute poverty wages. It was a society practically begging to snap. In fact, rapid industrialization had shoved 53% of the industrial workforce into these massive factories of over 500 workers. That kind of concentration made them highly receptive to radical, revolutionary ideas.
All right, moving to Section 2, cracks in the empire and the 1905 warning whistle.
Let's jump to 1905 and see how this pressure cooker actually started to vent. It was triggered by the Bloody Sunday Massacre, a horrific event where peaceful protesters were gunned down by Tsar's troops. That sparked a massive wave of anti-Tsarist protests and strikes, dealing a huge setback to the autocracy. Interestingly enough, it was during this exact upheaval that the very first Soviet, which just means Workers' Council, was formed to coordinate strike actions.
The Tsar's response to all this unrest? It was basically a classic bait and switch. To quiet the riots, he issued the October Manifesto, which promised civil liberties and a legislative body called the Duma. But then, right around 1906, he put out the Code of Fundamental Laws, which essentially hit the undo button on all of it. He declared his power was divine, kept absolute control over the military, and just gave himself the power to veto any single law the new Duma tried to pass.
Enter Premier Pyotr Stolypin. He tried to stabilize the countryside with land reforms that actually allowed peasants to own private land. But at the exact same time, he completely crushed political opposition. He dissolved the Second Duma, and on June 3, 1907, he completely rigged the election laws. He drastically cut representation for those rebellious borderlands we talked about, ensuring that conservative landowners held all the real voting power.
Which brings us to Section 3, the World War I catalyst, or turning up the heat. So, the fragile system somehow survived 1905, right? But a global conflict was about to push it into total, catastrophic collapse. The crucial question we have to ask our sources is, what was the ultimate catalyst? What took this incredibly strained empire and finally shattered it for good?
Well, the answer is World War I. Russia entered the war completely unprepared, and it led to just catastrophic military losses. We're talking millions of men and vast amounts of material loss between 1914 and 1916, largely due to incompetent leadership and severe ammunition shortages. The military leadership just didn't have the strategic capability for a drawn-out modern war.
And that triggered a devastating domino effect back home.
Drafting millions of men caused massive labor shortages that crippled the factories and led to nationwide starvation. All the fuel, all the raw materials, they were siphoned off to the military, meaning civilian factories had to just shut down. By 1917, total war expenses had multiplied 7 times over, forcing the state to finance 60% of its costs entirely through loans. The economy was completely ruined.
While the Tsar was out floundering at the war front trying to command the military, things back in the capital got outright bizarre. You had the highly unpopular political interference of Tsarina Alexandra and her reliance on the infamous mystic Rasputin. This dynamic totally destroyed whatever legitimacy the monarchy had left. The public just saw a weak Tsar making hasty, disastrous decisions, completely isolating the regime from its own people.
Section 4. The Twin Revolutions. The 1917 explosion.
The pressure could not be contained any longer. 1917 saw not one, but 2 distinct, world-altering revolutions in just a matter of months. First up was the February Revolution. Our sources describe this as a totally spontaneous, unstructured mass uprising. It was driven by extreme food shortages and striking workers in Petrograd. But the real turning point? That happened when the Tsar's own troops mutinied and actually joined the insurgents. That successfully forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. 300 years of Romanov rule just gone.
But the new Provisional Government that stepped in, they really struggled. They were paralyzed by this dual power sharing agreement with the Petrograd Soviet, which was a super influential council of workers and soldiers. Even worse, the Provisional Government kept delaying vital land reforms for the peasants. And fatally, they completely ignored the public's desperate demand for peace, stubbornly insisting on honoring alliances and keeping Russia bleeding in the World War.
Enter Vladimir Lenin. Returning from exile in April 1917, he brilliantly exploited this failure. He rolled out a radical blueprint known as the April Theses, using just 3 simple, powerful words to win over the exhausted masses: peace, land, and bread. He demanded an immediate end to the capitalist war, redistribution of land to the peasants, and food for everyone. He also relentlessly pushed the slogan, "All power to the Soviets."
So, armed with massive popular support and a highly energized network of local Soviets, Lenin's Bolshevik Party executed a meticulously planned, largely bloodless coup to seize state power. On October 25th, the Bolsheviks captured the Winter Palace, overthrowing that paralyzed provisional government, and set up a council of people's commissars, with Lenin right at the helm.
The actual mechanics of 1917 are just a fascinating study in contrasts. The February Revolution? That was a spontaneous, mainstream riot that organically toppled an ancient empire. October, on the other hand, was a highly calculated, systematically planned political takeover. It was engineered by a disciplined vanguard party that directly targeted the elite provisional government.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the Bolshevik legacy and the fallout.
The explosive events of 1917 were over, but why does this matter to us today? Well, because it forever altered the geopolitical landscape we're living in right now. Our sources show this legacy proved that a major state could actually operate and modernize outside of a capitalist framework. It established the world's very first socialist state. It inspired the global spread of official communist parties, including massive ones in China and India. It introduced centralized economic planning, most famously through Stalin's 5-year plans. And by founding the Comintern, it hardened a two-worlds divide and seriously boosted anti-colonial and trade union movements all over the globe.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought about the cyclical nature of power and revolution. The Russian Revolution toppled a regime where the public had absolutely no voice. But in replacing it, did the highly disciplined Bolshevik vanguard truly deliver power to the people, or did they simply construct a brand new kind of autocracy? It is a question that completely defined the 20th century. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember to always keep questioning the history behind the headlines.